does. Makes us look a little ghostly, but that's okay.
Gives us better lighting.
I'm so much shorter than you, which is funny because I'm the tall one.
It's because I'm sitting on another pillow.
I know. It makes me laugh though because it kind of reminds me of Good Mythical Morning, where Link is 6 foot tall. Hello, everybody.
Welcome everyone who's coming in. Thank you for coming. I have a screen to share really fast. We can get you talking in the chat a little bit. Okay, that's the question there to answer. Why do you write?
So while people are coming in, we might as well answer that question.
That's a great question.
Now, I think I mainly write because it's fun and it makes me feel good.
Okay, so earlier when she kind of asked that question during the keynote, I realized that the reason why I write is because it brings joy to me to see other people enjoying a world that I have created and loved. Yeah.
All the people in the chat we know in real life, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you to everybody we don't know. Excited to get to know you guys.
I like a lot of these answers. I love all of them, but there are some of these that I'm like, I really resonate with that.
Yeah.
Torture, yes. It's funny because you don't think you enjoy torture, and then you start torturing your characters, and you're like, why is this so strangely satisfying?
Yes, I love the idea of people falling in love with like my writing. Like that just makes me so happy. Man, this chat does go so fast.
It goes so fast. I mean, if you're ADHD like me, it's fine. I'm just like, damn, I'm keeping up, but
It is, and it goes nonstop the whole time too.
My goodness.
Okay, I will let you all continue to answer that if you'd like, but I will get started with the reminders and introductions. So I know you've all heard this several times already today, but remember to keep comments in the chat, and if you have specific questions for the authors, put them in the Q&A section so that they don't get lost by the end. Keep everything appropriate. Please don't share personal information. And I think that's all. I will put a link to King's English in the chat in a bit if you are interested in buying any books from the presenters today. And I will introduce our authors. So this is Jade Davis and Cheynne Ingalls. And Jade is 19 and has been writing creatively for the past 6 years. In addition to avidly reading and writing, Jade loves to sing, dance, and study languages, her favorite being Latin. She works at multiple libraries, that's impressive, and loves the opportunity to share her passion for stories with others. Cheynne Ingalls lives in Utah. Her stories, Mary Celeste's Secret and Helping Munnin, I think, were published in TABC's previous anthologies, Band of Misfits, Adventures on the High Seas, and Join Our Clan. Writing continues to be her passion, causing her to keep a notebook and laptop permanently glued to her side. We are so excited to have you both here and learn from you. And I will stop sharing and make you the host, and then you will have full control of everything.
Wonderful.
All right.
Share my screen now. So our class is going to be on how to write a novel together without killing each other, which surprisingly is actually kind of hard.
It's actually really difficult. Your writing is your baby, and so you have joint custody of this child, but sometimes you do not get along. So we're joint custody.
Yep. So one quick note before we begin. We have a pen name for both of us writing together just to simplify things, and that is CJ Victorin. And then when we have our names, that's just our actual names, Jade Davis and Cheynne Ingalls, that's just the things we've done separately. So all of our contact info that we will give you later on is going to be under CJ Victorin. And that is also what our website is under, and a bunch of other fun things like that. So let's get started.
Okay, so basically to summarize this really quickly so we can get to the actual lesson, we met in Latin class, we both figured out we loved mythology and writing, and the rest is history.
So yeah, we've been writing together for nearly 5 years. We were both published in the Join Our Clan anthology. We've also been published in a couple of the other teen author bootcamp anthologies, and I've also been publishing some poetry collections. If you want any of the links for those, you can go to our website, and I'll give you that link later, and all the information is there. Also we'll give you later is the email for us, and so there's a lot of information in this PowerPoint. If you want a copy of it so you can go through and have that for your own notes, feel free to email us and we will definitely send that to you. So here we go.
Okay, so finding the right co-author. I have tried to co-author books about 12.5 times. Been very sparsely successful. So we're just going to go over some common writing mistakes, different strategies, communicating with your co-author, and then our own personal method that we found works the best out of our other methods.
So first up, how to find the right person to write with.
So you need to make sure that it's easy to talk about your story, because if you guys have trouble talking about certain story elements and can't get on the same page, that's going to be a big problem. You have to be willing to compromise. You have to have complementary writing styles. We found that really helps. What she does best at, I do worst, and vice versa. So as a result, it helps our writing styles to bolster up where it's needed, rather than just being super strong in one place and being terribly weak in another place.
Yeah. And the most important thing out of all of this in finding the right person is that you make sure you have a good working relationship with them. That comes first. Everything else that relates to the writing, it comes second. Because if you don't have a good relationship with them, the writing's going to suffer.
It's not just about the writing. If you make it just about the writing, it'll become too professional. There is such a thing as too professional of a relationship.
And you need to be able to have fun and let, ideas come loosely. So that's a big important thing, is being able to just have fun with them and have a good relationship. So with that, we have a couple examples.
So as I mentioned before, balance is crucial. Generally try to find someone that balances out what you're good at with what they're good at, and they're different things, not the same thing. You can make it work if it's the same, but it's generally better if you find someone who complements your writing.
Yeah. So with that, I have a fun number of experiences where I've had either people that I just can't write with because we just don't work well in that regard.
Sometimes you just don't get along.
And sometimes we just don't get along, especially when it comes to writing. Mm-hmm. And so I've had people in the past, like in middle school, who I've wanted to write with, but whenever we try, it goes so terribly.
You're great friends, but the writing does not happen.
And so you have to say no, and you can't be afraid to say no. The other thing that is important to note in finding the right co-author is you can have more than 2 people writing things together.
Oh yeah.
It just gets really hard when there's more than 2 people.
It gets messy.
So there is one strategy we'll talk about a little bit later that addresses more than 2 people. But for the most part, we're just going to talk about writing with 2 people.
Generally.
And that's because it's easier, because there's only 2 schedules, 2 opinions, 2 of everything to deal with instead of more than that. So it's good to keep that in mind. So speaking of that, now we have a couple strategies we're going to go over that are pretty commonly used to write things with other people. So first up, we have alternating chapters. And this is pretty common, and it's really good. And we do a variation of this. But for the most part, what ends up happening with other people we've talked to is they will take turns writing and editing chapters. So I have this process example here on the screen where you have the one person who writes the odd chapters and the other person writes the even chapters.
And then they switch.
And so what will happen is the first person will write the first chapter, give it to the other person. They'll edit it, go through, make sure everything's in character, everything's kind of how they agreed, and they'll do the first round of edits, and then they'll write the second chapter. then they'll send that back to the first one. The first person will review the edits that were made in the first chapter, just so they know what kind of went on, make sure there wasn't anything that got changed that needed to be changed back. And then they'll edit chapter 2, write chapter 3, and that'll just kind of keep going throughout the whole book. So a good example of this that is a published book is Ali Condi and Brendan Reich's Dark Deep series. That's how they wrote this one, and that one's actually pretty good. So if you guys want to read a good example of that, definitely go check it out.
Yep. This particular, you're going to hear a lot about this particular unnamed superhero story. It was our big problem, but because it was a big problem, we learned a lot from it. This one had a main character switching chapters, and it worked, but we weren't as familiar with it. So make sure that you practice a little bit as you go. Make sure, and when you switch characters, make sure that you're switching in such a way that you don't mess up where the plot is trying to go. That's part of the problem that we ran into.
Yes, we were trying to force the plot to go different places, but that's another problem. But alternating chapters is a really good way to go and a really safe way to go.
Okay, so make sure that you and your co-author have an equal say in things. Don't just have one co-author being like the bossy one and you're just the doormat. You need to both have a say in things. It's okay to have an opinion. It's good to have an opinion, actually. We do address later, there's a proper way to handle having opposing opinions.
And this works for any of the strategies, is talking about opinions, but it's especially important for this particular one, which is where you co-write the chapter together. You're not just one person writing the chapter.
Right. So with this particular example, I have an unfinished Harry Potter fan fiction that I did with someone in high school. It's a Hufflepuff Slytherin romance, and it's dorky and it's beautiful. But what ended up happening in that one was I would take the chapter, every other chapter. So I would write my chapter and then I would pass it to her, and she would write the next chapter, and then she'd pass it back. And we just kept passing it back and forth, including even I would take it home some days and she would take it home other days. And it worked really well, except for the fact that sometimes you had to make sure you were on the same page. So just make sure you're on the same page when you do that. But otherwise, that method can work really well, actually, depending on what type of author you are.
Yes. So then the last strategy we're going to talk about that's not ours is when you have more than 2 authors. And this works best when you each write a book in the series. Some popular examples of these would be the 39 Clues books and the Spirit Animal books, if you guys have read those.
Love those ones.
Those are really good, and they're really awesome examples of this because they have all different authors. But with that, it's important that all of the authors that are going to be writing this series have a plan and they talk frequently about what's going on with the series. And this is especially important as sometimes the characters just say, by the way, I'm going to do this. And you kind of don't have a choice but to go along with it. And then
the other authors are going, whoa.
We didn't discuss this. So you have to, talk with people and be like, hey, is it okay, if we go this way? I think this would be really cool, so and so and so forth. But the nice thing about this is you do get a lot of individual freedom with the book you're writing, but you don't get a whole lot of say in everybody else's story other than the overall plot. And you have to be okay with being more of a plotter than a pantser. Exactly. So if you're a pantser, this probably isn't going to be the way to go for you.
If you're a plotter, however, this might be great.
Yes. One fun thing is she is a plotter. I am a pantser.
So this method that we have later on works for both pantsers and plotters.
Which is a good thing because some of these other strategies are you basically have to be a plotter because you are working with another person to figure it out.
Right.
So now we're going to go over a few common mistakes.
Yep. So, oh boy, this story. So this story doesn't even have a name because we originally just wrote it because we really liked this couple dynamic that we had created with 2 characters. And so we just were like, here, let's just write fluff fan fiction basically about these characters that we made. Which was great, except for the fact that we had no idea where it was going. And so as a result, I had all these plans. She got bored and pulled a freaking "it was all a dream" thing on me. That was fun. I was upset. So you need to make sure that you have at least a basic gist of where you're going. I recommend 3-act structure or 7-point plot structure. It's very, very basic, so it works well with pantsers, but at the same time, us plotters are able to know where we're going.
And that way, if you're a pantser and you're starting to get bored, you know where it's going and you go, oh, it'll be exciting in like 5 pages.
I just have to wait a little bit.
I just have to wait a little bit. But there's also the flip side of plotting too much.
This story, we literally plotted it to death, which made me happy. It made my plotting side so happy. She was not happy.
I was not happy. So this superhero story, we were like, okay, there's going to be the spy government and the opposing side and all of these tiny little interactions.
And
We had all of the tiny interactions planned, and it was terrible because I was bored the entire time we were writing.
I loved knowing where we were going. She was like, we're taking a left turn here. Okay, and
oh, it's a car chase. How fun. I already know how this is ending. So that for me was hard. So there is a thing is too little plotting and too much plotting.
And that's why the 7-point plot structure and 3-act structure are a good way to go. They're nice in between.
It's a loose outline. It's a loose outline.
They're very loose, which really helps.
Which is good because you still need to have some discussion beforehand so you can resolve conflicts.
Yep.
Before you kind of start.
Because that way you can find a compromise. If you wait until the last minute, so let's say you know that in chapter 3 they're going to have this big confrontation and you want it to go one way and your co-author wants to go another way, you got to discuss that before you get to chapter 3, because if you then hit chapter 3, then you're just going to end up in a big argument trying to move forward and you can't move forward. So make sure that if you have any issues up front, solve them up front. Don't wait till you get there.
Yes. And that's a hard balance to find with plotting, but not plotting too much. But you have to discuss things like, hey, I want this to happen in a little bit. And you discuss it then when you come up with those things.
Yep.
So the other important thing to do is not to make the mistake of not putting aside time to write.
And even if it's just a little time, like 1 hour on Saturday, like you have to make the time.
If you don't make the time, you won't find it. And all of a sudden the story's not going to be there. It's going to have died out. The nice thing is, though, if it does die out, you can always come back and revive it later. We've done that many times where we're like, we just are kind of done with the story. We don't know where we want it to go next. Let's just kind of let it die and we'll do something else. And then later we'll be like, oh, I had an idea for that one story from like 3 months ago. Let's go do that again. And so we will. So there's always room to, fix those mistakes, go back and rework things, which is also really nice.
Definitely. Okay, now the most important part, communicating with your partner.
This is super important.
So, like we mentioned earlier, don't just talk about the book, talk about life. If you are stressed out beyond belief, you have finals next week and you have no idea what you're doing, and your co-author is like, oh my gosh, let's get together and write this week, and you're like, I don't have time. Don't just tell them, okay, and get like blow up at them and get frustrated, or alternately be like, hey, I don't have time, okay, thanks, bye. Like, communicate with them and just be like, hey, I'm really stressed, how about we schedule next week? Like, give them hope for the future, but at the same time, don't be afraid to say no to them.
Because your mental health and the other things you're doing are super important to be able to not only, communicate with each other, but to get the story written in general.
You can't keep good quality writing if you're stressed out as heck. I mean, some people can do that, not me. Don't ignore each other. If you're upset about something, don't just dance around the issue and passive aggressively kind of mention comments. Just be straight up and honest. Like, I mean, don't be rude, respect each other, but don't at the same time avoid the issue. That's not good either.
Because you have to resolve it somehow.
Mm-hmm.
And most oftentimes that's going to have to be talking to each other and telling each other what the real problem is, which we've had to do on so many occasions.
Sometimes there's an underlying problem and you don't even realize what it is until you're talking with them. And then you realize, oh,
that's the problem.
That's the issue.
Yes. And so the other important thing with communication is if you need a little bit of space to cool down so you're not yelling at them, take the space you need and say, hey, I need to go cool down. I need a little bit of time to step away from the issue. Tell them that so they can be like, oh, okay. You just need a little bit of processing cool down time, and then we can talk about this and resolve it.
Right. And sometimes even if you don't think you need time, if you both are getting really heated in your argument, just step back.
Step back, take a break.
Tell each other, let's just take a break.
Yes. And that is going to help you so many ways. And with that, we had a number of arguments with our superhero story. That was another reason it went so terribly.
So I am definitely not your classic girly girl. I want death and destruction and action. And Jade just wants the couple to get together and be cute and kiss already.
I just want them to be happy and fluffy.
And I want to torture them more. So with that, that's part of the problem with the superhero story. There was this great family dynamic and this romance, which she loved.
I loved it.
I was bored.
And
I wanted to go have them shoot something.
And we wouldn't tell each other when we were bored. And so the romance section would go on for like number of chapters.
And I'd be bored. I'm like, can we throw in a car chase? Can they go, I don't know,
let's do something else. And so then we'd switch and do action, but then we do that for like 5 or 6 chapters. And I'd be like, I'm bored. Just like shoot me now. Like if I can be done with this and just get back to the fluffy romance, like, oh, you're injured, let me heal you. I will be happy.
That will be okay.
So that was hard to figure out.
Yeah. And then the last point, not everyone has a problem with this, but enough people have a problem with it. It needs to be addressed.
Yes. And that is letting personal problems infiltrate the story. Well, I have a fun story about this. When I was in high school, we were writing a story we now call War Against Chaos. But one of the characters, Amara, she was a very stubborn, feisty character. You know, somebody who kind of gets a bit riled up and excited about a lot of things. I was going through a hard time in my life, and I didn't talk about my problems. And I let Amara take the brunt of my anger issues.
Which was fun, because I was the romantic interest character playing the guy, and the poor guy was just going, what? Calm down. What did I do to deserve your ire?
And it wasn't actually the character's problem. It wasn't Amara's problem. It was mine. I was angry about things in my life, and I was like, so I'll just have Amara be angry about things in hers. When really, Amara didn't need to be, or even want to be,
a reason for it.
Angry. Exactly. And so I let my personal problems sink into my character and be like, I'm now making a problem for the story itself. So I had to figure out how to talk about that and be like, hey, I'm having a hard time. Let's talk through this so I can get it out of my system and let Amara be Amara. So that's another reason why it's super important to communicate.
Okay.
Now to move on to our method.
So this works well for plotters, pantsers. It's very basic, very general. It's not hard to learn. It's down and dirty.
I've had people I've tried to co-write with, like co-writing chapters, alternating chapters, all of those, and none of them have really worked super well. And then we tried this. So
it does take an extra bit of work later, but
yes,
we'll explain that here in a minute.
It helps a lot in just getting the story down in a first draft. So we'll go over a few different things, some formatting, kind of what we start with, which is character setting and main concept. We'll talk a bit about friendly discourse, like arguing, because, you know, you kind of have to do that sometimes to get to a good compromise place. And we'll also talk about the idea of role play and turning it into prose, which we will now introduce with our formatting.
If you want, you can also call it scripting. Whatever.
Scripting also
as you
works.
can see, it looks a lot like a script once you're finished. You have the bolded name, colon, everything in asterisks is related to their actions. Everything else is talking. Generally, it's present tense just because that helps when you're kind of role-playing / scripting it out. It feels a lot more in the moment. And it's very interesting because if you divide the characters up, right, you never know what the other person's going to say, except for the fact that you know the basic gist of the plot.
So, for example, in this scene, we know, all right, they need to talk and get to somewhat of a resolution. We know that, but we don't know how that's going to happen. So we started.
And as a result, we continue to go along that path of they need to resolve this eventually, but we weren't exactly sure how. So we just started writing, and eventually the characters kind of resolved their own problems,
which was nice. A plotter and a pantser, because the plotter,
you were able to discover how they resolved it.
I didn't know how it was going to end up resolved, so that was really new, versus, you know, when you talk about it like every line, you're like, yeah, that's boring. move on.
Right.
But her plotting side was really happy because it's like they will get resolved and then there's a fight and like all this cool
I
stuff.
knew what was going to happen, even if it was just the gist of what was going to happen.
So that was really fun. And another thing with that is, so we have, if I can go back to the right slide, this is just kind of an additional formatting bigger. You have the bold typeset and then some other fun things. You can come back and reference this. If you'd like, you can take a picture, but
we keep it as basic as we possibly can.
It's very simple and we don't want to overcomplicate things.
Don't overcomplicate it.
Because it's not worth it.
Just change fonts for characters. Don't do that.
It's terrifying. Just keep it very uniform, the same, and you'll be able to much easier understand it and write it.
Yep.
So now how do we write this? So we have two different methods of what we use to write on.
Yeah.
The first is Google Docs. And that's because we can both be on it at the same time, even if we're not in person together. The thing to know about this is after about 100 pages, it starts to lag.
Yeah.
And it will start to mess with just how fast you can type, how fast you can see what the other people are typing.
You can get above 100 pages, but it's gonna get weird.
It's gonna get weird. It's just gonna get bad. So about every 100 pages, what you're gonna want to do is make a new document. And how we do that is we have this story, The 5 Realms. We have a character document. So all of the pictures and all that we'll go over next slide are all there. And then we have our story documents, which we label 5 Realms 1, 5 Realms 2, 5 Realms 3, etc.
etc.
We have about 16 of them. So it's a really long story.
But
we have them in order where we know, okay, Doc 1 ends and picks up in Doc 2.
Chronologically.
But it's not all on one document where it's going, I'm taking forever to load.
That would literally be 1,600 pages.
Yeah. So it's a lot of writing. And Google Docs is not going to love you if you have that much on one document.
No. Google Docs will have a tantrum.
It will. The other thing you can do that we've done is writing on notebook paper. Now, here's the important thing.
Yeah.
It doesn't require internet, but you have to be together to do it.
Yeah.
Especially since you're going back and forth, you're passing the notebook every other line.
Mm-hmm.
And then,
unlike the one with the other person that I had where you can pass it along chapter-wise, this is in the moment. You have to be sitting next to each other.
With that, it works best when you're sitting and doing things where you can sit next to each other and have some notebooks out, like, class. We did this in many of our classes at school when we were in high school, and it looks like note-taking because, it's in a notebook and you're writing things down.
Please don't fail your class.
Don't fail your classes. Please pay attention. We're not advocating that. But, if part of finding time to write ends up being in classes you share together where you sit right next to each other and can just slide it across the desk at each other, it works really well. So just don't get caught, because then people will be weirded out and be like, what are you writing? This isn't even note-taking. And you'll have to explain everything, which is just so much more complicated.
Oh boy. Yes. Also, make sure that you consolidate it all into one binder, because you will go through notebooks crazy fast.
So once you finish a notebook, you're going to want to put it somewhere where you can keep all of the notebooks together. We have, for one story, 3 different binders, 3 of them, where we've just put all of the notebook paper in it after we finished them. And when you are writing in a notebook, you have to have at least 2 different backup notebooks on you at all times, because you go through it faster than you think you do.
And definitely make sure you have the binder, because there have been some times where I've done this and I don't know where that notebook went.
So you have a story somewhere. You just don't know where. So make sure you know where it is, and make sure you have backup notebooks so you can keep writing even when you run out of paper in the one.
Yep.
And then once you finish the notebook, make sure to go put it with the others. So another note with that is, don't use both formats for the same story at the same time.
Pick one.
Pick one. We tried this once with the War Against Chaos. What ended up happening is we'd write during school and class. I'd go home, try to type it all up on the computer so we could keep going after school. And then once that would end, I would try to write it all down in the notebook, so then when we get to school, we'd be back on track to do that.
She was doing a lot of extra work.
It was unnecessary. Don't do it. At that point, just do 2 separate stories.
Unless
one
you
on
want
paper,
to be that extra.
Unless you want to be that extra, true.
But
do 1 on paper, 1 on Google Docs. And that's how we ended up writing the 5 Realms story and our War Against Chaos story at the same time. So we had a good number of stories and ideas that we were having going on in our minds all at once, but one was on paper and one was on Google Docs, and that's how we made it work.
So with character building, this is a very basic setup that we use. We don't go crazy in depth like a lot of people do. I know that some people do that, and I love that. That's cool. But this is just as basic as you get. Name, age, gender, height, appearance, personality, flaws, likes, dislikes, backstory, and if you feel it's applicable, sexuality. In today's day and age, it seems to be applicable, but it's not always applicable.
Sometimes you're writing middle grade, and that's not necessarily something that ends up being addressed.
Right. So if applicable, that's just there.
Yes.
And your character sheet doesn't have to be that filled out. Like, for instance, right here, this is the way Jade does her character sheets. Super detailed. Mine was the one earlier that was shown on there with Dare. Not as filled out, not as fleshed out. It has maybe 3 sentences per thing. And that's because I discover the character as I write. I just know the basics. She has the character fully fleshed out from the beginning.
I have like a backstory that results in a character, and she has a character that results in a backstory.
Yep, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah. So another thing that we have to do with that is then balancing with the whole plot overall. And we've had a bunch of questions about this. This is how we do it. We have 3 different plots: plot A, plot B, and plot C. So
plot A is the action plot. So for instance, with this, we had the War of the Realms. They were constantly fighting, and there was a lot of problems, social unrest, political injustice, all the types of stuff that I'm in love with and adore. And then there was plot B that was much more Jade's speed.
It was all the cute relationship, like, oh my gosh, they had tension, they were a thing before, but now they're not. She thought he was
romance, dead. But it's not top of my list.
But for me, it's top of the list, like, oh my gosh, they have to get together.
And that's why we write so well together, because of the fact that we have those complementary styles.
Exactly. And when you blend the 2 of them, you end up with
Lix and Dare both being co-generals fighting a war, simultaneously trying to raise a family.
Which is a very interesting dynamic. But it also
trying to be a mom, a dad, and a general of a war. It's fun.
It is. But it's how we were able to blend that particular story into a cohesive plot that we both liked. Because there was equal moments of fighting in a war and taking care of the family.
Yep.
Now we have the arguing section. We've had so many fun things with this. Important thing to remember when you're arguing or having this type of friendly discourse: acknowledge each other's good points.
Yeah. Don't just say, I hate this about this, or I don't like this about your writing.
Say, Cheyenne, I really like how, your idea has this, but I think it would be enhanced with this.
And then if you don't agree with them, don't immediately shoot down their point. Just be like, okay, so what can we do to find common ground? Because I don't like that either.
So you have to, be willing to work calmly, and that's part of taking a little bit of space to cool down before you argue more. And eventually you'll use both sides of things to come up with a good idea. One example of this that we'll talk about is the character death of a character, which I know is redundant. We don't want to say the name because spoilers.
Yes.
I really wanted the character to die.
I did not. Even though she's the romance person, in this instance, we totally flipped roles. And I was like, I am all for this romance. And she was like, nope, so-and-so needs to die. And I was like, excuse you? I'm finally into the romance and you're just going to murder them.
What ended up happening is the character did die, but we worked to a compromise where it was how the character died that we got to a compromise about. Because I wanted her to just straight up be murdered. She wanted it to be something that wouldn't destroy the other character's self-esteem and motivation to do anything.
Mm-hmm.
So we did it in a way that it was like a sacrifice to save those they loved, which ended up working as a good compromise for the 2 of us.
So it ended up instilling the character to do more and be more heroic rather than wanting them to curl up into a puddle and never move again.
Exactly. Another good argument example that we've had is we had a concept for a story that we call the Descendants story. The reason being is the original concept was Mark Antony and Cleopatra from history ended up having secret descendants who happened to be cursed. And we had, they have to work together to break their respective curses. The argument came in at the point where it was, well, I want the curse to be broken one way, and she wants the curse to be broken in another. Because we have two characters with two curses that are two different types of curses that need to be broken with the same, solution. Which is really hard when you have an action-based curse.
Yep.
And a romance-based curse, because you can't.
That didn't work very well.
You can't just true love's kiss the action problems away.
Oh yes, that works so well.
And you can't just fight the romance curse away either. We had to work together to blend and find a cohesive solution, which in our case ended up being there is somewhat of the sense of true love and fighting for those you love, but there was a champion for both sides of the argument. And if one champion won, the curses would stay intact. Yep. And if the other champion won, then it was because they were chosen with the true love, that kind of side ideal prevailed. And that's what broke the curse. And so we had to work together to compromise for a good couple months on that one. It was a really, really long argument.
Yeah. And then there are just simple things that you argue over, sometimes like pronunciation of names, but those type of things
are a bit more trivial.
Ultimately, just let it go if you're the co-author. Speaking from the one who did not want to pronounce it the way she pronounces it, just let it go.
So the example with that is we had the character name spelled there as Cyrielle. Cheyenne wanted to pronounce it
Cyrielle because there's a CY.
And I wanted to pronounce it Cyrielle.
And I immediately thought of cereal.
Like the type you eat. And I was like, no, it's not cereal, it's Cyrielle.
And I'm like, and the difference?
The solution we came up with that is part of my problem was she wanted to use the nickname CY as Cy for the character. And I was like, no.
Which doesn't work if her name is
Cyrielle. That doesn't work. You can't have Cy.
I don't want her nickname to be Siri. No.
We're not going there. What ended up happening is I got to keep my pronunciation of Cyrielle, but her nickname ended up being Elle.
It just worked better.
It worked better, which was really nice.
Okay, so with this, as you can see, this is the prose version of this scripting over here. Roleplay scripting, whatever you want to call it, depending on if you're a D&D nerd or not. We are. But with that, you notice that this can be very basic. For example, licks, parries in vain. But on the prose side of things, it becomes licks, parried, but in vain. With a swift counterattack, Dare had cornered her. And so it's like, you took something that was pretty basic over here and turn it into something a lot more intricate when you do prose. So it is slightly more work. But transitioning is a lot easier than doing this straight up the first time.
With two people.
So, you can do it, it's just harder.
Yes. So this particular example, the prose is from Lix's point of view. And Lix is my character. Dare is Cheyenne's. And with the role play, as we mentioned before, you do it in present tense. Mm-hmm. Personally, I like a third person past tense, and we both tend to do for our prose. And so when you transition, you have to make sure you're transitioning all the verbs, making sure they match the new tense. But part of that also is enhancing the descriptions, adding imagery. Mm-hmm. You can do a lot more with that, but you're doing it from your character point of view.
This is just keeping it as basic as possible in the scripting, and then you can flourish it a lot more in the prose.
It's basically like taking the first draft and editing it to make it a better second draft. The only difference is instead of having prose first draft, you have a script format first draft. And I found it really nice because then when you're writing with somebody, even if one of the chapters is going to be from a certain person's point of view, all of the characters are going to stay in character and have reactions true to them. So I'm not trying to guess what her character is thinking. Yep. And she's not trying to do the same for mine.
That's part of the major problem is you're trying to guess what the other person would say for their character.
And that's why with the alternating chapters,
you know exactly what they're going to say because she dang wrote it.
Yeah.
So,
and with the earlier example of, alternating chapters where you go back and edit the other person's, that's mainly what you're doing is you're going in and making sure like, my character would never actually say that.
Right.
They wouldn't
in this
think
case,
that.
You already know that that's what they were gonna say because they wrote it or you wrote it. they're never going to be out of character because you were the one who wrote it. Well, unless you wrote them out of character, in which case that's your fault.
That's a different problem. But yeah, so that way when whoever is writing that chapter turns it into prose, all the characters are going to stay in character. The only editing it needs is not the dialogue edits, but the actual description edits themselves.
Right.
And we found that works really well because then you already have it all written and you can actually work on writing the prose chapters at the same time, which means if I'm writing chapter 1, Cheyenne can be writing chapter 2 at the exact same time. And so it goes by quicker in the sense of editing and turning it into this second draft. So that's the end of the information. If you have any questions at all, or if you want to check out some more of the books we've written and the specific stories, you can, here is our information. We have our website, which is tinyurl.com/cjvictorin, and we have all sorts of fun information on there.
We have an Instagram, Facebook,
and we also have an email. So if you'd like a copy of this PowerPoint, feel free to email us or contact us through Instagram or Facebook, and we will get that to you.
Yep.
And if you have any other writing questions about writing together or anything like that, we are totally free to take some time to respond to you. We would love to do that.
No,
so
yeah, happy to do that.
if you have any questions or any of that, please, contact us and let us know. We would love to help.
There are actually 10 questions in the Q&A if you'd like to look at those right now.
Yes, we were just about to move on to that. So thank you for listening to us go on forever. Let's go on to Q&A.
No, you have about 10 minutes, so you can answer plenty of questions. I think
Wonderful.
You did good on time.
Sweet.
We were worried about that.
We did practice this several times to make sure our timing would be okay. All right.
Let's go with the first question. So, how do you encourage each other to keep going when one or both of you don't feel like it?
This is a great question because she has this happen all the time, and I'm like, I want to keep writing, and she's like, nope, I'm done.
I had a whole entire month at one point where I was like, I just can't. So for an entire month, we didn't write with each other. It was painful for her.
It was bad.
But I needed it.
But she needed the break. And sometimes you just need a break from that particular that particular story. That's kind of how I've compromised in the past because I have to keep writing. I have to keep writing with her, or else I'm just not going to want to write with her anymore because I'm going to lose the interest that I had.
And part of that is because Cheyenne is very ADHD, and so she just needs to keep going. I
have to keep going.
She has to keep going. I just necessarily can't do that. So if I'm having trouble with this story, we'll end up switching stories so that I'm entertained with the newness of it.
Right.
But we're not writing.
And on top of that, sometimes we'll change to a more chill plot line if you're feeling particularly stressed. And like we had a dystopic story at one point that was stressing her out too bad.
That was the one where I stopped for a month.
But that was stressing her out too bad. So we ended up switching to another story that was a lot more tame and fluffy.
Yes.
Because she could not write that at that point.
But it was still writing. And that's the important part is even if you're not writing something that you know is going to get published, you're still writing together. You're still practicing all these skills.
Right.
That's the important thing.
Okay.
So mainly that encouragement is we just keep writing. It's just something else.
Yeah. Find something else that you can do in the meantime while they take that break.
Yes. Let's see. What's the next question? Do we have Do you have to create a consistent writing voice to use together, or is it okay for voices to differ?
Okay. That's an interesting one.
I'd say we have similar but very distinct voices.
Very distinct. Mine has an almost gothic dark undertone to it.
Mine has a more romantic feel.
More romantic. So it blends together nicely, kind of gives it this gothic romantic feel in the end. But at the same time, they are distinctly different. But so don't go too crazy, like have first person chapters and third person chapters.
Keep it consistent
across the prose, but
it's okay to have slightly different
voices.
Especially because you're going to most likely be alternating character perspectives, and different characters have a different feel to them.
And
so
it's going to give a different
because you've written it with the dialogue and all that beforehand, you'll have a cohesive overall feel, and that's really helpful, especially if you have two different, slightly different voices.
Despite the individual voices.
Yes. It's basically the difference of, for example, Rick Riordan, it's the difference between a Percy chapter and an Annabeth chapter.
Right.
Is Percy has a bit more action, has a bit more of that voice, and Annabeth has a bit more of an intellectual voice.
Much more logical.
And much more logical. And you can kind of see that reflected just in how they, almost talk in their head and, kind of how they see things. So that's a good example of you can still have the different voices.
Right.
It's just one cohesive story. See, the next question is, do you ever find that a character is too much like yourself, so it becomes a self-insert?
Yeah.
We purposely put ourselves in some of our stories. So yes.
So yes, that has been done. I think the best way to avoid this though is if you find that they're a lot like yourself, find ways to purposefully make them different. Not so different that you hate the character, but like for instance,
something distinct about
them. For instance, there's a character that I recently created that had a lot of similarities to myself. But what I ended up changing about it was the fact that she was a lot more of a tomboy. She liked a lot more gritty stuff. She was a little bit more edgy, which I am not.
Even though I
enjoy writing edgy stuff, I am not edgy.
She's not edgy.
A floof.
Exactly. And so just having that, a few core differences where you're like, I'm not edgy, but they are, even though they have a lot of other similar things, it really helps.
It gives it enough of a different tone that you're okay.
Yeah. Right. What book are Lix and Dare from? Ooh, that's fun. They're from our Five Realms world. They're the story that we definitely want to get published the most.
Okay.
We just have to assemble things because there's so many sections of the story.
Okay. On top of that, it's 1,600 pages. It's gonna be a while.
Yeah. And we have a prologue story for it, so we might do that one first. And then there's
So thank you for asking. I appreciate that. I'm glad you're interested in them. I love Lix and Dare.
They're our favorite.
They're our favorite characters that we've probably ever created.
Yeah, their universe is like our baby. Like we love that.
That's part of the reason we called it Joint Custody. That was our
baby. Yep. So we have that. Okay. Do you have any tips for writers writing together over Zoom to get faster or get more put down during each session?
Okay. I find this one really interesting because I hadn't considered that before, but I feel like that would work really well, especially with talking through ideas. There are some times when, if we're busy or other things like that, I will keep a text chat open on the side screen as I'm keeping the other tab open. So as we're writing, we're solving other problems on the side and figuring things out, making sure that everything's going smoothly. And if we're running into issues, like the other day, she mentioned like, my character's bored. Is there something your character can do to make it more interesting? And I was like, okay, cool. Add in some demons.
Yeah.
So I do think that Zoom sessions,
just make sure you have the document and you're writing on it as you're talking.
So that way you're getting stuff done while you're working out the problems.
Don't just talk.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Because then you could talk forever.
It's important to be able to learn to multitask. So how many authors is too many? I'm writing a book with 3 other people. Wow, that is a very ambitious thing, and I applaud you if you are making it work, because we have tried multiple times to write with multiple other friends.
So many times.
And it just ends up getting split off into 2s and 2s, and it just really doesn't end up having a lot. I think there's no strict rule of there is, 5 or 6 authors is too many. You can have as many as you want. It's more just an opinion of how many can you handle.
Yeah, it's more about what can you handle as a group. And like we mentioned before, some of those other methods work a lot better when you have more than 2 people. Although you can make the scripting method work, it's just a little difficult with scheduling. Trying to make sure you're all on the document at the same time. That was the real trick.
Okay. How do you write the characters your co-author created in an in-character way? So I feel like we addressed that one pretty well.
With our format, it's a lot easier. With the other, though, I can't address this because I did do the every other chapter thing in high school with my other friend. That it was more just about, I had to really get in the head of that character, and I had to think about what they would say all the time, to the point where I would even go to lunch and I would be like, how would the character describe this lunch? And then I would describe it to my other friend and they would say, oh my gosh, that's hilarious, totally something they would do. Or they'd be like, more like this. And the more I talked to her about how they would even describe basic daily things, it gave me enough of a voice tone that I was able to keep it consistent to the best of our ability.
Yeah. Okay. The next question is, what happens if you guys can't agree on some description? So I think the only time that's really relevant is when you're looking over the prose, because that's really when description comes into play. And a lot of
Yeah.
times it's more just character voice rather than us not agreeing. It's just the character's perspective on things.
Right.
And so we don't necessarily have that problem. And that's mainly because all of the other things that we've written before that in the role play
Oh, we're running out of time.
Yes, I know, I'm sorry. Yeah, that helps, negate the arguing in the prose version.
Okay.
Okay, next
Favorite
question.
part of
We are unfortunately, I think, out of time.
So if any of
We're
your
gonna have to
questions,
wrap up.
feel free to email them to us,
And we
or
will
put
answer
them on
them.
Facebook or Insta, and we will answer.
We will answer them, yes.
Please DM us on Insta or email us. We will answer.
We will answer, yes.
That would be awesome. Okay, thank you so much, both of you, for your presentation. I learned a lot of interesting things, so I hope that everyone else has as well. I think there's also one more class, right, before the final keynote, so I will let you all go to your next round.
Okay.
Thank you
Have fun.
again. Bye, everyone.